You wake up, but you don't remember falling asleep. The straw beneath your body has turned to dust and pricks your skin like 1,000 tiny needles. Your eyes adjust to the pre-dawn darkness, and the first thing that hits you isn't the sight, it's the smell. Human waste, unwashed bodies, the metallic tang of old blood, and something else. Something that smells like death warming over. You try to sit up, and immediately, the iron collar around your neck reminds you of its presence. The metal is cold, heavy, and carved with letters that spell out your owner's name, not yours. You haven't had a real name for 3 years now. You're just boy or girl, or sometimes, if you're lucky, they'll grunt in your direction when they want something. The person next to you is coughing. That wet, rattling cough that means they probably won't see another winter, maybe not another month. In the corner, someone is whimpering in their sleep, reliving whatever horror brought them here. A child, you think, though it's hard to tell anymore. Malnutrition has a way of making everyone look ancient and infant-like at the same time. Your bare feet touch the stone floor and the cold shoots through your body like lightning. There are no windows in this room. Windows are for people, not property. But you can hear the city of Rome waking up above you. Cartwheels on cobblestones, the distant shouts of free citizens starting their day. The sound of life happening to other people. You're in the basement of a villa in the Aventine Hill district, one of 7 hills that make up the greatest empire the world has ever known. The year is 79 AD, and Rome controls everything from Britain to Egypt, from Spain to Syria. 90 million people call themselves Roman citizens, enjoying rights, protections, and freedoms that won't be seen again for 1,000 years. You are not one of them. You are one of the estimated 30 million people in the Roman Empire who wake up each morning knowing that your body, your time, your very breath belongs to someone else. You are a slave. And in this moment, as the first rays of sunlight creep through the cracks in the ceiling above, you remember exactly how you got here. Maybe you were born into it, inheriting your mother's chains like some twisted family heirloom. Maybe you were captured in Germania, watching your village burn as Roman legionnaires marched you south in shackles. Maybe you were a Greek scholar, sold into bondage to pay your father's debts. Maybe you were a gladiator who lost one too many fights. Maybe you were a Christian, caught worshiping the wrong God at the wrong time. It doesn't matter how you got here. What matters is that you're here now, and the day is about to begin. The door at the top of the stone stairs creaks open, and heavy footsteps echo down toward your quarters. The overseer, a freed slave himself, desperate to prove his loyalty to the master, begins shouting in Latin mixed with whatever barbaric tongue he spoke before Rome civilized him. Up, up, you worthless sacks of meat. The sun rises, and so do you. Around you, bodies begin to stir. Some groan, some whimper, some say nothing at all. Those are usually the ones who won't last much longer. You've learned to read the signs. When a slave stops complaining, stops crying, stops making any noise at all, they're getting ready to die. You stand up, your knees popping like branches in a fire. You're 19 years old, but your body feels like it belongs to someone 3 times your age. The iron collar around your neck weighs 6 pounds, and after 3 years, the muscles in your shoulders have permanently reshaped themselves around its burden. The overseer is getting closer, and you can hear the familiar whistle of his whip, cutting through the air. He doesn't need to use it. The sound alone is enough to get everyone moving. You've felt that whip before, felt it tear through your skin and leave scars that will never fully heal. The first time it happened, you cried. The second time, you screamed. By the 10th time, you barely flinched. Pain has become your constant companion, as familiar as your own heartbeat. You look around at the other slaves shuffling to their feet, and for a moment, just a moment, you allow yourself to wonder what your life might have been like if you had been born free. If you had woken up in a comfortable bed with a window to look out of, with the knowledge that your day belonged to you. But that kind of thinking is dangerous. That kind of thinking is what drove Marcus, the slave who used to sleep where the coughing person now lies, to try to escape. They caught him after 2 days and crucified him on the road outside the city, leaving his body to rot as a warning to the rest of you. Hope, you've learned, is a luxury you can't afford. The overseer reaches the bottom of the stairs, and his eyes sweep across the room like a farmer inspecting his livestock. That's what you are to him, to your master, to the empire that built itself on the backs of people like you. Livestock. Valuable livestock perhaps, but livestock nonetheless. You thought your Monday morning was bad? You might ask someone from the 21st century. Try waking up as property in the greatest civilization the world has ever known. Your day is about to begin, and it will be exactly like yesterday and exactly like tomorrow and exactly like every day until the day you die. Welcome to ancient Rome. Welcome to slavery. Welcome to the reality that built an empire. Your bedroom, though calling it that is like calling a grave a vacation home, measures 8 feet by 12 feet. Concrete walls, concrete floor, concrete ceiling, no windows, no ventilation, no consideration for the fact that human beings need fresh air to survive. But then again, the question of whether you're truly human in the eyes of your captors remains complicated. 6 other people share this space with you. 7 human bodies in 96 square feet, with a ceiling so low that the tallest among you, a Germanic warrior named Klaus who hasn't spoken since they brought him here 2 years ago, has to keep his head permanently bowed. The Romans didn't design these quarters for comfort. They designed them for storage. The walls weep moisture constantly, leaving everything perpetually damp and growing things that shouldn't grow in places where people live. Green mold creeps up from the corners like slow-moving death, and when the winter rains come, water seeps through the ceiling and pools on the floor, turning your sleeping area into a swamp of human misery. There are no beds. There never were. Each of you has been given a pile of straw that was probably fresh when Emperor Nero was still alive, which is to say it's been rotting for over a decade. The straw has long since turned to a kind of dusty mulch that provides about as much cushioning as sleeping on broken glass. Rats have nested in it, and sometimes you wake up to find them watching you with their tiny black eyes, as if wondering which one of you will die first so they can begin their feast. The person sleeping next to you is a woman named Julia. Or, at least that's what she was called in the household where she worked before being sold to your current master. She's maybe 30 years old, though slavery has aged her face beyond recognition. She was a house slave once, which means she lived inside the villa, wore decent clothes, ate regular meals. House slaves are the aristocracy of the slave world. But Julia made a mistake. She caught the master's eldest son trying to rape one of the younger kitchen girls, and instead of looking the other way like a good slave should, she intervened. The next morning she was sold to your current master and demoted to the lowest form of slave labor, sewage maintenance. That was 6 months ago. Now Julia spends her days crawling through the underground tunnels that carry Rome's waste, cleaning blockages by hand, breathing in the toxic fumes that have already given her the lung disease that causes her nighttime coughing fits. She probably has another year to live, maybe 2 if she's unlucky. She never talks about her old life, but sometimes in her sleep, she calls out names that might belong to children she once knew. Children who were probably sold to different masters when she was punished. In the Roman slave system, family is just another word for leverage. Across from you sleeps Demetrius, a Greek scholar who taught philosophy and mathematics before his master's creditors seized all his possessions, including him, to pay off debts. Demetrius still has most of his teeth, which means he hasn't been here as long as the rest of you, but his hands shake constantly now from the manual labor he's forced to perform. Yesterday you watched him try to write his name in the dirt with his finger, but his hands trembled so badly he gave up halfway through. There's the boy. Nobody knows his real name or age, but he couldn't have been more than 12 when they brought him here. The Romans have a special fondness for child slaves. They're easier to break, easier to train, and they last longer. This boy was probably taken from one of the Germanic tribes during the recent campaigns. He has the fair hair and blue eyes that Roman masters find exotic and valuable. The boy doesn't speak Latin, doesn't speak Greek, barely speaks at all anymore. But he has the 1,000-yard stare that you recognize in all the slaves who've given up. His body still goes through the motions of living, but everything behind his eyes has already died. In the corner there's an old man whose name no one remembers. He might be 50, he might be 30, It's impossible to tell. His back is so bent from years of hauling stone that he can't stand upright anymore, and his breathing sounds like wind through a broken pipe. He's been a slave longer than anyone, and he's developed the peculiar madness that sometimes comes to people who've lived their entire lives as property. He talks to himself constantly, carrying on conversations with people who aren't there, laughing at jokes no one else can hear. Sometimes, late at night, you hear him whispering prayers to gods whose names you don't recognize. Gods from whatever land he came from before Rome erased his identity and turned him into a number in a ledger. The woman in the other corner never speaks, never makes eye contact, never responds to anything. She rocks back and forth constantly, and the other slaves whisper that she was used as a breeding slave, forced to produce children who would be born into bondage and sold away from her as soon as they were old enough to work. They say she had 7 children over the years. They say none of them lived past their 10th birthday. They say that when her last child died, something broke inside her that can never be fixed. And then there's Klaus, the Germanic warrior who towers over everyone despite his permanently bowed head. Klaus was captured during one of the recent campaigns in Germania, and the scars covering his body tell the story of someone who didn't surrender easily. His left hand is missing 3 fingers, punishment for trying to strangle an overseer during his first week here. But Klaus has something the rest of you have lost: rage. It burns behind his eyes like a forge fire, and sometimes you wonder if that rage will eventually consume him or save him. The soundscape of your underground prison is a symphony of human suffering. During the day, when most of you are working above ground, the silence is almost peaceful. But at night, when 7 broken people are crammed into this concrete box, the sounds begin. There's Julia's coughing, wet and horrible, mixed with the old man's whispered conversations with his invisible friends. The woman in the corner makes a low humming sound, not a song exactly, but some kind of rhythm that might have comforted her children once. Klaus grinds his teeth in his sleep, a sound like millstones crushing grain. The boy sometimes whimpers, though he tries to muffle it by pressing his face into his straw. Demetrius recites Greek poetry under his breath, verses from Homer and Sappho that he's desperately trying not to forget. Education, he once told you, is the only thing they can't take away from a man. But you've watched him struggle to remember simple words lately, watched the poetry slip away from him like water through his fingers. They can't take education away, but they can bury it under so much trauma that it might as well be gone. And underneath it all, there's the sound of the city above you. Rome never truly sleeps. Even at night, you can hear the distant rumble of cartwheels, the shouts of the night watch, the sounds of a civilization built on the foundation of your suffering. Sometimes when the wind is right, you can hear laughter drifting down from the villa above. The master and his family enjoying their evening meal, entertained by musicians and storytellers, while you lie in the dark, wondering if tomorrow will be the day you finally break. The temperature in your underground cell is a constant reminder that comfort is not something you deserve. In winter, the concrete walls turn into ice caves. There's no heating, no fires, no blankets. You sleep pressed against each other for warmth, sharing body heat with people who were strangers before bondage made you family. Your breath comes out in visible clouds, and sometimes you wake up to find that the moisture from your breathing has frozen on the walls. Klaus once told you, in the broken Latin he's been forced to learn, that in his homeland, people would die if they were exposed to cold like this. But people in his homeland were free. Free people, he said, have the luxury of dying when conditions become unbearable. Slaves have to keep living. In summer, the concrete box becomes an oven. The heat radiating from the stone is suffocating, and there's no air circulation to provide relief. You sweat constantly, losing precious fluids that your meager rations can't replace. The smell becomes unbearable even by your standards, and the mold and bacteria flourish in the humidity created by 7 people breathing, sweating, and slowly dying in an enclosed space. Your body has adapted to this environment in ways that would fascinate physicians and horrify anyone with a conscience. Your skin has become thick and leathery from constant exposure to rough stone and metal. Your lungs have learned to extract oxygen from air that would choke a free person. Your digestive system has adapted to function on scraps that wouldn't be fit for animals. But your mind is where the real damage shows. You've learned to sleep with your eyes half open, ready to wake at the first sound of trouble. You've learned to eat as fast as possible, because hesitation means someone else might take your food. You've learned to show no weakness, because weakness invites abuse from both overseers and fellow slaves. Most importantly, you've learned to think only about today. Yesterday is gone, and remembering your old life only makes the present more unbearable. Tomorrow might never come, and hoping for freedom only sets you up for disappointment. Today is all you have, and today is about survival. The other slaves have become your family, not by choice but by necessity. You've seen each other at your worst, sick, broken, terrified, hopeless. You've shared what little food you could spare, covered for each other when someone was too weak to work, held each other when the nightmares became too much to bear alone. But you've also learned not to get too attached. Slaves disappear. They die, they're sold, they're transferred to other duties. Julia won't last much longer with her lung disease. The old man grows weaker every day. Even Klaus, for all his strength and rage, is showing signs of the wear that breaks down even the strongest men. Your sleeping area isn't just a room, it's a waiting room, a place where people wait to die, or wait to be moved somewhere else to die, or wait for their minds to break completely so that death becomes irrelevant. Still think your apartment is too small? You might ask someone from the modern world. Try sharing 96 square feet with 6 other people who've lost everything, including hope. But as the overseer's footsteps grow closer, and the new day demands your attention, you push these thoughts away. Survival means focusing on the next task, the next meal, the next chance to make it through another day. The concrete walls of your cell have witnessed things that would make free people weep, but concrete doesn't weep. It just endures, just like you do. Just like all of you do day after day in the greatest civilization the world has ever known. This is your home. This is your world. This is your life. Welcome to the reality behind the glory of Rome. The overseer is climbing down the stairs now, and you know what comes next. Morning inspection. Not because anyone cares about your health or well-being, but because a dead slave is a worthless slave, and your master didn't spend good money on you just to watch you rot away from preventable diseases. Line up, the overseer shouts in his accented Latin. Let me see what kind of animals I'm working with today. You and your 6 cellmates shuffle into a rough line, heads bowed, eyes down. The overseer, a man named Gaius, who earned his freedom 15 years ago and has been trying to forget he was ever one of you ever since, walks down the line like a farmer inspecting livestock, which in every way that matters to the Roman legal system is exactly what you are. He stops in front of Klaus first, always Klaus. The Germanic warrior is too tall, too proud, too obviously dangerous to ignore. Even bent over as he is, Klaus radiates a kind of controlled violence that makes even freed slaves nervous. You, Gaius says, pointing at an infected cut on Klaus's shoulder. What's this? Klaus doesn't answer. He learned early that speaking without permission only brings punishment. This cut is festering, Gaius continues, more to himself than to Klaus. If it spreads, you'll be worthless for heavy labor. Clean it. Clean it. As if Klaus has access to clean water, soap, bandages, or any of the things a free person would use to treat a wound. What Gaius means is, figure out how to keep working despite the infection, because if you can't work, you'll be sold to someone who uses slaves until they die, rather than someone who uses slaves until they're no longer profitable. The inspection continues down the line. Julia's persistent cough earns her a dose of wine mixed with honey, not because anyone cares about her comfort, but because tuberculosis spreads quickly in confined spaces, and sick slaves don't work efficiently. The boy's ribs are showing more prominently than last week, so his food rations will be increased slightly. Again, not out of compassion, but out of economics. When Gaius reaches you, he grabs your chin and forces your mouth open, examining your teeth like you're a horse he's considering purchasing. 2 of your molars have rotted away completely over the past year, and another one is loose enough that it might fall out any day now. In the free world, You might visit a physician or a tooth puller. In the slave world, you chew on the other side of your mouth and hope the pain doesn't get bad enough to interfere with your work. You stink, Gaius says matter-of-factly. It's not an insult, just an observation. You do stink. You all stink. It's been 4 days since your last bath, and that bath consisted of cold water from a communal trough that 20 other slaves had used before you. Personal hygiene, you've learned, is not a right. It's a privilege that has to be earned through good behavior and efficient work. And even when you earn it, Roman slave hygiene is nothing like what free people enjoy. Once a week, if you're lucky, and if you haven't done anything to displease your overseers, you're allowed to wash. The washing area is a stone courtyard behind the kitchen, where several large wooden tubs are filled with cold water that's been used for washing dishes, cleaning floors, and occasionally rinsing out chamber pots. There's no privacy, of course. Privacy is another luxury reserved for humans, not property. Men, women, and children all wash together, under the watchful eyes of the overseers who want to make sure no one takes longer than their allotted time or uses more than their fair share of the precious soap. The soap itself is a harsh, lye-based mixture that strips the oil from your skin and leaves it raw and cracked. It's made from animal fat and ash, and it burns any open wounds you might have. The first time you used it, you thought you were being punished for something. Now you know that burning is just what cleanliness feels like when you're property. You get 3 minutes to wash your entire body, including your hair. 3 minutes to scrub away a week's worth of sweat, dirt, blood, and the various bodily fluids that come with hard physical labor and communal living. 3 minutes to feel almost human again before returning to your underground cell to begin accumulating another week's worth of filth. Your clothing, singular because you own exactly one outfit, gets washed at the same time, in the same cold, dirty water. You stand naked in the courtyard while your tunic soaks, shivering even in summer, trying to scrub the worst of the stains out of fabric that's been worn by dozens of other slaves before being passed down to you. The tunic itself is a marvel of Roman efficiency and cruelty. It's made from the coarsest wool available, woven specifically to be uncomfortable against the skin. The idea is that a slave should never forget their status, never feel comfortable, never have a moment when their clothing isn't reminding them that they don't deserve comfort. The wool is full of burrs, thorns, and other debris that wasn't properly cleaned out during processing. It chafes against your skin constantly, leaving permanent rash marks on your shoulders, chest, and thighs. In hot weather, it becomes unbearably itchy. In cold weather, it provides just enough warmth to keep you alive, but not enough to keep you comfortable. You have no undergarments. No one does. The tunic is all you get, and it has to serve every function: protection from the elements, modesty covering, work clothes, and pajamas all in one. When it wears out, which happens every 6 months or so, you're given another used tunic that previously belonged to a slave who died, was sold, or was promoted to different duties. Sometimes, if you're very observant, you can still see bloodstains on your new clothing. Your feet are always bare. Shoes are for people who own themselves. Your feet have developed thick calluses that would impress a marathon runner, and they're permanently stained with dirt that can never be completely washed away. In winter, your feet crack and bleed from the cold. In summer, they burn on the hot stone pavements. Year-round, they're decorated with cuts, scratches, and the occasional infected wound from stepping on something sharp. But it's not just the external cleanliness that's controlled and rationed. The most degrading aspect of slave hygiene is the bathroom situation. Roman civilization is famous for its advanced plumbing, its public baths, its sophisticated understanding of sanitation and public health. Roman citizens enjoyed toilets with running water, elaborate bathing complexes with hot and cold pools, and sewage systems that would be considered impressive even by modern standards. None of this applies to you. Your toilet is a communal latrine in the basement of the villa, a stone bench with holes cut into it positioned over a channel that carries waste away through the sewage system that Julia now maintains. There's no privacy, no toilet paper that won't be invented for another 1,000 years, and no regular cleaning. 20 people share this latrine, 20 people with digestive systems weakened by poor nutrition, contaminated water, and constant stress. 20 people who suffer from various intestinal diseases, parasitic infections, and stomach ailments caused by eating food that's often spoiled or contaminated. The smell in the latrine area is beyond description. It's not just the odor of human waste. It's the smell of sickness, of bodies that can't properly process what they're being fed, of people who are literally rotting from the inside out. The flies are so thick you have to wave them away from your face while you're using the facilities. There's no toilet paper, so you use whatever's available. Scraps of fabric, handfuls of straw, or sometimes just your hand followed by a rinse in cold water, if you're lucky enough to have access to it. Diseases spread quickly this way, passing from person to person through the most basic human functions. Privacy doesn't exist. You perform your most intimate bodily functions in full view of your fellow slaves, and they perform theirs in full view of you. Dignity, modesty, personal space. These are concepts that have no meaning in your world. And then there are the parasites. Lice are your constant companions. They live in your hair, your clothing, the straw you sleep on. You can spend hours picking them out of your scalp, crushing them between your fingernails. But they always come back. They bite, they itch, they spread from person to person, no matter how careful you try to be. The lice are nothing compared to the fleas. Fleas jump from person to person, from the straw bedding, from the rats that share your living space. Flea bites become infected easily, turning into painful sores that take weeks to heal. Some fleas carry diseases, plague, typhus, other illnesses. They can kill you slowly and painfully. But the worst are the internal parasites. Intestinal worms are almost universal among slaves. They come from the contaminated water you're forced to drink, the spoiled food you're given, the unsanitary conditions you live in. They live in your gut, stealing what little nutrition you manage to consume, growing fat while you grow thinner. You can feel them sometimes, moving inside you. You see them sometimes when you use the latrine, long, white, segmented creatures that have been feeding off your body. Some slaves try to starve them out by eating even less than their already meager rations, but that usually just makes the slave weaker, while the worms continue to thrive. The physical discomfort of poor hygiene is constant, but it's the psychological impact that's truly devastating. Cleanliness, in the ancient world just as in the modern one, is closely tied to dignity and self-respect. When you're forced to live in filth, when you smell bad, when your body is crawling with parasites, it becomes harder to remember that you're human. That's not an accident. It's part of the system. A clean slave might remember what it felt like to be free. A clean slave might maintain some sense of personal dignity, some spark of self-respect that could grow into rebellion. A filthy slave, covered in their own and others' waste, eaten alive by parasites, stinking of sweat and sickness. That slave is constantly reminded of their position at the bottom of society. Your fellow slaves have learned to live with these conditions, but they've paid a price for that adaptation. Julia tries to maintain some standards, using her precious drinking water to wash her face and hands when she can. But the lung disease that's killing her makes her cough up blood, and she often can't control when or where that happens. Demetrius, the former scholar, has given up almost entirely on personal hygiene. His hair is matted, his fingernails are black with grime, and he's developed a nervous habit of scratching at his skin until it bleeds. Sometimes you catch him staring at his own hands as if he can't believe they belong to him. Klaus maintains his warrior's pride as best he can, using his bare hands to try to keep his hair and beard relatively clean. But even Klaus has been worn down by 3 years of forced filth. His scars have become infected repeatedly, and his skin has the gray pallor of someone whose body is losing the fight against constant contamination. The boy has never known anything else, so he doesn't fight the filth the way the adults do. He's accepted lice and fleas and intestinal worms as normal parts of life. In some ways, that's the most heartbreaking thing of all, watching a child grow up thinking that misery is just the natural state of existence. When Gaius finishes his inspection, he nods with satisfaction, not because any of you are healthy or clean, but because none of you are sick enough to interfere with the day's work. You're functional property, and that's all that matters. Wash day is tomorrow, he announces, and you feel a mixture of relief and dread. Relief because you desperately need to clean yourself. Dread because wash day also means increased scrutiny from the overseers, and increased scrutiny often means finding excuses for punishment. Try not to die of plague before then, Gaius adds with the kind of casual cruelty that freed slaves often display toward current slaves. The master doesn't want to replace any of you this month. As he climbs back up the stairs, you're left to contemplate another day of accumulated filth, another day of living like an animal while serving people who bathe in perfumed water and wear silk. Still think you have it rough because your shower ran out of hot water? You might ask someone from the 21st century. Try going a week without any water at all, then washing in liquid that's been used to clean floors. But there's no time for such thoughts now. The day's work is about to begin, and work means moving from one form of misery to another. At least when you're working, you're too exhausted to think about how badly you smell, how much your skin itches, or how the parasites in your gut are slowly consuming you from the inside. This is Roman hygiene for slaves. This is cleanliness in the greatest civilization the world has ever known. This is what it means to be property in an empire built on human suffering. The overseer's voice echoes down the stone corridor like the sound of approaching doom. Food line. Move your worthless carcasses before the sun gets any higher. This is the moment you've been waiting for since you woke up, though calling it food requires a generous interpretation of the word. Your stomach has been gnawing at itself for hours, reminding you that you haven't eaten anything substantial in over 18 hours. But then again, you haven't eaten anything truly substantial in 3 years. You and your fellow slaves shuffle up the stone steps toward the kitchen area, your bare feet slapping against the cold floor in a rhythm that sounds like a funeral march. The smell hits you before you reach the top, not the aroma of cooking food, but something closer to the stench of controlled rot. The kitchen slaves, a step above you in the hierarchy because they work inside the villa and occasionally get to, eat scraps from the master's table, are ladling out breakfast from large iron cauldrons that look like they haven't been properly cleaned since the reign of Emperor Claudius. Your breakfast is pulmentum, a porridge made from whatever grains are too moldy, too old, or too contaminated for free people to eat. Today's batch appears to be made primarily from barley that's been infested with weevils, mixed with water that has the cloudy appearance of liquid that's been sitting in containers for far too long. The slave ahead of you in line, a man who works in the stone quarries and whose cough suggests his lungs are slowly turning to dust, receives his portion in a wooden bowl that's been carved by hand from scrap lumber. The bowl has cracks in it where bacteria can hide and multiply, and it's never been properly sterilized because sterilization is a concept that won't be fully understood for another 18 centuries. When your turn comes, the kitchen slave, a woman whose left eye has been clouded over by some untreated infection, ladles a portion of the porridge into your bowl without making eye contact. Eye contact between slaves can be dangerous. It reminds everyone involved that they're human beings, and human beings might start thinking about things like dignity, hope, or rebellion. The porridge in your bowl is gray-brown in color and has the consistency of wet cement. You can see the weevils floating in it, small black specks that move occasionally when the light hits them right. The kitchen slaves don't bother to strain out the insects anymore. Protein is protein, and slaves can't afford to be choosy about the source. You take your bowl and wooden spoon, the only eating utensil you own, and find a place to squat on the stone floor of the courtyard. Standing while eating is forbidden, because standing suggests equality, and equality is not something slaves are allowed to contemplate. But sitting on furniture is also forbidden because furniture is for people, not property. So you squat, like an animal, and begin forcing down your morning meal. The first spoonful tastes like mushrooms, but not the pleasant, earthy mushrooms that free people enjoy. This tastes like the mushrooms that grow in dark, damp places where things go to rot. The barley has fermented slightly, giving the entire mixture a sour tang that makes your mouth water in the wrong way, the way it waters just before you vomit. You chew carefully, because biting down too hard on a weevil makes it pop in your mouth, releasing a bitter fluid that tastes like concentrated misery. But you have to chew because swallowing the porridge whole would be worse. Your weakened digestive system needs all the help it can get to extract what little nutrition exists in this mixture of grain, insects, and decay. The second spoonful contains something that might be a piece of straw, or might be part of a rat's tail. You don't investigate too closely. In your world, ignorance is often the only thing that stands between you and complete despair. Around you, 20 other slaves are having the same experience. Some eat quickly, wolfing down their portions as if speed might somehow improve the taste. Others eat slowly, trying to make the meal last as long as possible because this porridge, horrible as it is, represents the only food you're guaranteed to receive today. Klaus, the Germanic warrior, eats with the methodical efficiency of a soldier. He's trained himself to think of food as fuel rather than pleasure, and he consumes his portion without any visible reaction to its quality. But you notice that his hands shake slightly as he lifts the spoon to his mouth, not from fear or weakness, but from barely controlled rage at what his life has become. Julia, the former house slave, picks at her food with the resignation of someone who knows she's dying. Her tuberculosis has destroyed her appetite, and every meal is a struggle between the need for nutrition and the knowledge that eating often triggers coughing fits that bring up blood. She takes tiny bites, chews them carefully, and swallows with the concentration of someone performing brain surgery. The boy, still nameless, still silent, eats with the desperate hunger of someone whose growing body is being starved into stunted development. He scrapes every last bit of porridge from his bowl, then runs his finger around the inside to collect any residue that might remain. Child slaves burn through calories quickly, and their rations are often insufficient to support healthy growth. As you're choking down your third spoonful, one of the kitchen slaves approaches with a large clay jug filled with what passes for drinking water in the slave quarters. She pours a cup for each person, not enough to truly quench your thirst, but enough to help wash down the porridge. The water tastes of metal and dirt, with an underlying flavor that suggests it's been contaminated. With sewage runoff, it's been boiled, which kills some of the bacteria. But boiling can't remove the chemical contaminants or the taste of the lead pipes it's traveled through to reach you. You drink it anyway, because thirst is even worse than bad-tasting water, and because dehydration will kill you faster than waterborne illness. Your body has developed a tolerance for contaminated water over the years, though that tolerance has come at the cost of chronic stomach problems and frequent bouts of dysentery. The kitchen slave also distributes small pieces of bread, not the white bread that graces the master's table, but a dark, dense loaf made from whatever grain scraps are left after the good flour has been used for more important purposes. The bread is hard enough to chip teeth, and it has green spots where mold has begun to grow. But bread is bread, and you accept your piece gratefully. You dip it in your remaining porridge to soften it, creating a combination that tastes like wet cardboard flavored with pond scum. The mold adds a bitter medicinal taste that makes your tongue feel fuzzy, but mold is just another source of protein in your limited diet. As you're finishing your breakfast, you notice that the old man in the corner, the one who talks to invisible friends, is holding his piece of bread up to his ear as if listening to it whisper secrets. His mind has retreated so far from reality that he's begun having conversations with his food. The other slaves ignore this behavior, because madness is just another occupational hazard of prolonged slavery. The woman who rocks constantly hasn't touched her food at all. She holds her bowl in her lap, staring into the porridge, as if she can see her lost children reflected in its murky surface. One of the other slaves will eventually eat her portion. Waste is a luxury that property can't afford. But for now, everyone pretends not to notice her grief. This is your breakfast. This is how you begin each day in the Roman Empire, with a meal that would make dogs turn up their noses, washed down with water that might kill you slowly but will definitely keep you alive for today. Lunch, when it comes, will be more of the same porridge, perhaps with the addition of some vegetable, scraps from the master's kitchen, carrot peels, onion skins, the outer leaves of cabbages that have begun to rot. If you're very lucky, there might be a small piece of salt pork that's been cured so heavily it's more salt than meat. Dinner will be bread again, perhaps with a thin soup made from bones that have already been boiled multiple times to extract every possible bit of nutrition. The bones themselves, picked clean and brittle, will be given to the dogs. Even the dogs in a Roman household eat better than the slaves. On festival days, when the master is feeling generous or wants to demonstrate his benevolence to visiting dignitaries, you might receive an actual piece of meat. It will be the cut that's too tough for free people to chew, or meat from an animal that died of disease rather than being properly slaughtered, but it will be meat nonetheless. These special meals happen perhaps 3 or 4 times a year, and you remember each one with the intensity of a religious experience. The nutritional value of your daily rations has been carefully calculated by people who understand exactly how little food a human being needs to remain functional. You receive just enough calories to perform hard physical labor, just enough protein to keep your muscles from completely wasting away, just enough vitamins to prevent the most obvious diseases of malnutrition. But just enough is not the same as adequate. Your body is slowly consuming itself, burning muscle mass to make up for the calories your diet doesn't provide. Your hair has become thin and brittle. Your teeth are loose from vitamin deficiency. Your skin has the grayish pallor of chronic malnutrition. The psychological impact of constant hunger is perhaps worse than the physical effects. Hunger makes you irritable, makes it difficult to concentrate, makes you willing to do almost anything for a few extra crumbs. You've seen slaves inform on each other for an extra piece of bread. You've seen friendships destroyed over accusations of food theft. You've felt the temptation yourself, the willingness to betray people you care about for the promise of one decent meal. But perhaps the cruelest aspect of your dining situation is that you can smell what real food is like. The kitchen is directly above your sleeping quarters, and when the master's family is eating, the aroma of roasted meat, fresh bread, wine, and spices drifts down through the floorboards like a form of torture. You know what lamb tastes like when it's been properly cooked, with herbs and olive oil. You know the smell of fresh bread, still warm from the oven. You remember wine that tastes like something other than vinegar mixed with water. But these memories are dangerous, because they remind you of what you've lost, and dwelling on loss can drive a slave insane. The kitchen slaves, who have slightly more access to decent food, are both envied and resented by the rest of you. They occasionally slip you scraps when the overseers aren't watching, a gesture of solidarity among property, but they're also careful not to be too generous. Their position in the hierarchy is precarious, and being caught sharing food with lower status slaves could result in demotion to your level. There's also the constant fear that your food has been tampered with. Overseers sometimes mix purgatives into slave meals as punishment for real or imagined infractions. A slave who's spent the day running to the latrine with stomach cramps is a slave who's learned a lesson about obedience. Poison is another concern. Not poison meant to kill. Dead slaves are worthless slaves, but substances that cause pain, discomfort, or temporary incapacitation. Some overseers view food contamination as an entertaining way to break up the monotony of managing human property. But even without deliberate contamination, your food supply is a constant source of illness. Spoiled grain causes stomach problems. Contaminated water spreads dysentery. Moldy bread can cause hallucinations and liver damage. The weevils and other insects in your porridge carry parasites that take up residence in your digestive system. You've learned to eat anyway because the alternative is death by starvation, and death by starvation is slower and more painful than death by food poisoning. As you finish your breakfast and prepare to begin the day's work, you try not to think about the fact that this meal, inadequate and disgusting as it was, represents the high point of your nutritional day. Lunch will be smaller, dinner will be smaller still, and tomorrow's breakfast will be exactly the same as today's, made from the same contaminated ingredients, served in the same dirty bowls, eaten while squatting on the same stone floor. Still complaining about the quality of your cafeteria food? You might ask someone from the modern world. Try eating weevil porridge for 3 years running, then tell me how terrible your sandwich was. But there's no time for such comparisons now. Your stomach is full enough to function, your thirst is temporarily quenched, and the day's labor is calling. Work is the only thing that makes you forget about hunger, because work requires all your concentration just to survive. This is nutrition in the Roman Empire. This is dining when you're property. This is what it means to be kept alive, not healthy, not comfortable, not happy, but alive, in service to the greatest civilization the world has ever known. The empty bowls are collected by the kitchen slaves, who will rinse them in cold water and stack them for tomorrow's meal. No soap, no sanitization, just a quick rinse to remove the most obvious food particles. The same bowls will serve the same contaminated food to the same desperate people, day after day, until the bowls crack beyond repair or the slaves die, whichever comes first. After choking down your morning meal, you stand up from your squatting position and immediately feel the familiar sensation of your tunic pulling against your skin in ways that fabric should never touch a human body. The coarse wool, if it can even be called wool anymore, has become as much a part of your suffering as the iron collar around your neck. This single garment represents your entire wardrobe, your only protection against the elements, and the most visible symbol of your status as property in the Roman Empire. It's been your constant companion for 8 months now, ever since the previous tunic literally fell apart from wear and was replaced with this new one that had previously belonged to a slave who died of fever in the quarries. The tunic reaches to about mid-thigh when you're standing upright, though the hem has become so frayed and torn that it's more of a suggestion than an actual edge. The original color, if it ever had one, has long since faded to a sort of universal brown-gray that comes from years of dirt, sweat, blood, and other substances you try not to think about too carefully. The fabric itself is a masterpiece of deliberate discomfort. Roman textile workers who produce slave clothing are specifically instructed to use the coarsest fibers available, to leave in thorns and debris that would normally be removed during processing, and to weave the cloth loosely enough that it will snag and tear easily but tightly enough that it won't fall apart completely. Every thread seems designed to irritate your skin. The wool is full of barbs that catch and pull at your body hair, creating a constant low-level pain that never quite becomes unbearable but never allows you to forget it's there. Where the fabric rubs against your shoulders, your chest, and your thighs, it has worn your skin into permanent calluses that look like leather but feel like raw wounds. The neckline of the tunic has stretched out over the months, creating a wide opening that provides no modesty and little protection from cold drafts. In winter, wind cuts through this opening and chills your chest and back. In summer, the loose neck allows insects to crawl inside the garment, where they can bite and nest in the fabric without you being able to easily remove them. The sleeves, what's left of them, were originally short, reaching perhaps halfway to your elbows. But hard labor and constant wear have reduced them to ragged strips that provide no protection for your arms. Your shoulders and upper arms are permanently darkened by sun exposure, scarred by work injuries, and marked by the constant chafing of the rough fabric. But it's not just the discomfort of the material that makes your clothing a form of torture. It's the complete lack of undergarments, the total absence of anything between your body and this abrasive wool shell. Roman citizens wear multiple layers: a tunic, a toga, or stola, undergarments made from soft linen, and often a cloak or mantle for warmth and weather protection. Their clothing is tailored to fit, made from quality materials and replaced regularly when it shows signs of wear. You have one tunic. That's it. No undergarments means that every movement causes the rough wool to rub directly against your most sensitive skin. Walking becomes an exercise in pain management as each step causes the fabric to shift and scrape. Bending over to lift heavy objects, which you do dozens of times each day, causes the tunic to pull tight against your body in ways that create new pressure points and areas of irritation. The lack of proper underwear also means that natural bodily functions become complicated and embarrassing. When you sweat, which is constantly given the physical nature of your work, the moisture has nowhere to go except to saturate the wool tunic, which then holds the dampness against your skin for hours. Wet wool smells terrible and feels even worse, creating a clammy embrace that never quite dries completely. The tunic has no belt, no ties, no way to adjust the fit or secure it properly to your body. It hangs loose when you're standing still, but any physical activity causes it to ride up, twist around, or expose parts of your body that Roman society demands be covered. You've learned to move carefully, to always be conscious of how your clothing is shifting, because accidental exposure can result in punishment for indecency. The bottom edge of the tunic has been torn and retorn so many times that it now resembles fringe more than a hem. These loose threads constantly catch on things: door frames, tools, other people's clothing, thorns and brambles when you're working outside. Each snag tears the fabric a little more, gradually reducing the coverage the garment provides. Winter is when the inadequacy of your clothing becomes most apparent. Roman winters are cold and wet, with temperatures that regularly drop below freezing. Your single wool tunic provides minimal insulation, and the loose weave allows cold air to circulate freely around your body. You have no cloak, no additional layers, no way to stay warm except to keep moving constantly. During winter work details, slaves regularly suffer from frostbite, hypothermia, and cold-related injuries that can permanently damage fingers, toes, and expose skin. The wool, when it gets wet from rain or snow, becomes incredibly heavy and takes days to dry completely. Wet wool also shrinks, making the already uncomfortable tunic even tighter and more restrictive. But you can't take it off to dry it properly, because nakedness is forbidden and you have no other clothing to wear while this piece dries. Summer brings different but equally intense clothing-related suffering. The thick wool that provides inadequate warmth in winter becomes a suffocating blanket in summer heat. The fabric traps body heat and prevents air circulation, making it feel like you're wrapped in a furnace. The dark color of the tunic, achieved through years of accumulated dirt and stains rather than any intentional dyeing process, absorbs sunlight and converts it to heat that radiates against your skin. Working in the summer sun while wearing this garment is like being slowly cooked alive, but removing the tunic even partially is not an option. Roman law specifically requires that slaves remain covered at all times, partly for modesty, but mostly as a constant reminder of their status. Free people can remove clothing when they're hot, can change into lighter garments for summer, can adjust their dress for comfort and weather conditions. Slaves wear what they're given when they're told to wear it, regardless of comfort or practicality. The tunic is also a canvas for the violence of your daily life. It's stained with your blood from work injuries, whippings, and accidents. It's stained with other people's blood from times when you've had to help injured fellow slaves. It's marked with burns from working near forges and cooking fires, with tears from sharp tools and rough handling, with discoloration from the various chemicals and substances you encounter during your labor. Each stain tells a story of pain, but the stories are written in a language that only other slaves can read. Free people look at your clothing and see a dirty, poorly dressed servant. Other slaves look at the same garment and can read your history of suffering in the pattern of stains and tears. There's a brown mark on the left sleeve from the time you were beaten for dropping a heavy stone. Block. The ragged hole near the bottom hem is from when you got caught on barbed wire while working in the master's vineyard. The dark stain across the chest is from when Klaus coughed up blood during one of his lung illness episodes. And you held him until the fit passed. Your feet, of course, are completely bare. Shoes are for humans, not property. Your feet have adapted to this reality over the years, developing thick calluses that protect against sharp stones, hot pavements, and cold ground. But calluses can only do so much. In winter, your feet turn blue with cold and develop painful cracks that split open and bleed. In summer, they burn on hot stone and develop blisters that make walking agony. Year-round, they're vulnerable to cuts, puncture wounds, infections, and the kind of injuries that come from navigating a world designed for people who wear protective footwear. The soles of your feet are permanently stained black with dirt, blood, and substances that can't be washed away even during your weekly bath. Your toenails are cracked and broken from kicking against stone and metal objects. Several of your toes have been broken over the years and healed incorrectly, giving you a shuffling gait that marks you as a slave even from a distance. But perhaps the most psychologically damaging aspect of your clothing situation is how it marks you as different from free people. When Roman citizens see you on the street, they don't need to look at your collar or examine your skin for brands. Your clothing immediately identifies you as property. The contrast is especially stark when you're working in or around the masters' villa, where you're constantly exposed to the sight of people wearing clean, well-fitted, attractive clothing. The master's family dresses in silk and fine linen, in garments that are tailored to fit perfectly and replaced regularly when they show any signs of wear. Their children, some of whom are younger than you, own more clothing than you've seen in your entire life. They have different outfits for different occasions, different fabrics for different seasons, jewelry and accessories that cost more than most slaves will earn in a lifetime. And then there's you, in your single, filthy, uncomfortable tunic that marks you as less than human in the eyes of Roman society. The psychological impact of being forced to dress like an animal while serving people who dress like gods cannot be overstated. Clothing in any society is closely tied to identity, dignity, and social status. When you're forced to wear rags, when you're denied the basic human dignity of decent clothing, it becomes harder to remember that you have any worth as a person. Your fellow slaves have developed different strategies for coping with the clothing situation. Klaus maintains his warrior's pride by keeping his tunic as clean as possible during his weekly bath, scrubbing it with the same intensity he once brought to maintaining his weapons and armor. It's still a rag, but it's the cleanest rag he can manage. Julia has given up entirely on the appearance of her clothing, focusing instead on trying to keep it functional. She's become skilled at mending tears with scraps of thread and fabric, creating patches that extend the life of the garment even as they make it look even more like a beggar's costume. The boy has never known anything else, so he doesn't understand that clothing can be comfortable, attractive, or personally meaningful. To him, the tunic is just a fact of life, like hunger or cold or fear. In some ways, that acceptance is merciful. He doesn't mourn the loss of something he's never experienced. Demetrius, the former scholar, sometimes stares at his own clothing with the kind of intellectual fascination he once brought to philosophy: problems. He's trying to understand how a piece of fabric can be so systematically designed to cause discomfort, analyzing the construction techniques that make his tunic a wearable torture device. As you prepare to begin the day's work, you automatically adjust your tunic, trying to find a position where it causes the least immediate discomfort. It's a futile effort. There's no comfortable way to wear this garment, but the ritual helps you mentally prepare for another day of physical labor while wrapped in what amounts to a hair shirt. Still complaining about how uncomfortable your work clothes are? You might ask someone from the modern world. Try wearing the same unwashed wool sack for 8 months straight, with no underwear, no shoes, and no option to change when it gets torn, stained, or soaked with sweat. But there's no point in dwelling on comparisons between your reality and other people's comfort. Your tunic is what it is, and you are what you are, and the day's work is waiting. This is fashion in the Roman slave system. This is how property is expected to dress. This is what happens when clothing is designed not to protect or comfort the wearer, but to constantly remind them, and everyone who sees them, of their place at the bottom of society. The fabric clings to your skin as you move toward your work assignment, each step a reminder that even the most basic human need for appropriate clothing has been weaponized against you by the greatest civilization the world has ever known. The overseer's whip cracks through the morning air, not hitting anyone yet, but serving as a sharp reminder that your body has been purchased and your time belongs to someone else. The sound echoes off the stone walls of the villa's courtyard, like thunder, and every slave within hearing distance automatically straightens their posture and quickens their movements. Work assignments, Gaius shouts, consulting a wax tablet that contains the daily labor distribution. Your name isn't on that tablet. Slaves don't have names in the administrative sense, just numbers and descriptions. You are Germanic male, medium build, quarry work, and that designation will follow you until you die or become too broken to be useful. Today, like most days, you're assigned to the stone quarry operation that supplies building materials for the master's various construction projects around Rome. It's not the worst job a slave can have. That would be the sewage maintenance that's slowly killing Julia, or the gladiator training that's already killed dozens of slaves before you, but it's far from the best. The quarry work begins with a 2-mile walk from the villa, carrying the heavy iron tools that you'll use to break stone from the earth. The tools themselves are designed to be as uncomfortable as possible to handle. The hammers have rough wooden handles that splinter and cut your palms. The chisels are poorly balanced, making them difficult to control and likely to slip when you're striking stone. But the real challenge isn't the tools, it's the pace. Roman efficiency demands that a certain amount of stone be extracted each day, regardless of weather conditions, equipment failures, or the physical state of the slaves doing the work. The quota is based on calculations made by engineers who've never swung a hammer, managed by overseers who carry whips instead of tools, for the benefit of a master who's never seen the quarry except his numbers in his account books. You work in teams of 4 slaves, chained together at the ankles to prevent escape attempts and to ensure that if one person slows down, everyone suffers. Your current team includes Klaus, the Germanic warrior whose strength is both an asset and a curse, an older Greek slave named Philippos, whose hands shake from years of tool use, and a young Gaul who's been given the Roman name Marcus, but who whispers his real name, Brennos, when the overseers aren't listening. The work begins before the sun is fully up and continues until it's too dark to see properly. The process is simple in concept, but brutal in execution. You use hammers and chisels to break large stones into smaller, more manageable pieces that can be transported and used for construction. Each strike of the hammer sends vibrations through your arms, shoulders, and spine. After a few hours, your entire body becomes a single throbbing ache. But you can't slow down. The overseers patrol constantly, and they have quotas to meet just like you do. A slave who isn't working at maximum efficiency is a slave who needs motivation, and motivation comes in the form of leather whips that cut through skin and leave scars that never fully heal. The whip isn't the only form of workplace discipline. Slaves who consistently fail to meet their quotas are given reduced food rations, which creates a vicious cycle. Less food means less energy means lower productivity means less food. You've watched strong men waste away to skeletons because they couldn't maintain the pace demanded by Roman efficiency. There's also the threat of reassignment to worse duties. The quarry work is brutal, but it's preferable to the mines where slaves work underground in conditions that kill most people within 2 years. It's preferable to the gladiator schools, where you're trained to fight other slaves to the death for the entertainment of free citizens. It's preferable to the galleys where you row warships until your heart gives out from exhaustion. The knowledge that there are worse fates available keeps you working even when your body screams for rest, even when your hands are so raw from gripping tools that they leave bloody prints on everything you touch, even when the muscles in your back spasm from hours of bent-over labor. The physical demands of the work are complicated by the environment in which you're forced to perform. The quarry is essentially a hole in the ground, exposed to whatever weather Rome's gods decide to send. In summer, the stone reflects heat like a furnace, and the temperature in the quarry can reach levels that would be considered dangerous for free people. You work without shade, without frequent water breaks, without any protection from the sun except your single wool tunic. Heat exhaustion is common, heat stroke is frequently fatal, and the overseer's attitude toward slaves who collapse from heat is roughly the same as their attitude toward tools that break, inconvenient but replaceable. In winter, the quarry becomes a frozen hellscape where metal tools become so cold they stick to your skin, where your breath comes out in clouds so thick you can barely see, where the stone becomes slippery with ice and every step risks a fall that could shatter bones. Slaves who freeze to death during winter. Work details are left where they fall until the day's quota is met, then dragged away and disposed of in mass graves. Rain is perhaps the worst weather for quarry work, because wet stone becomes unpredictably slippery and dangerous, but the work continues regardless. You've seen slaves crushed when heavy stones shifted unexpectedly on rain-slicked surfaces. You've seen men lose fingers when their grip slipped on wet tools. You've slipped yourself more than once and learned that a fall in the quarry isn't just painful, it's potentially fatal. But weather is just one of the hazards you face during your daily labor. The work itself is inherently dangerous, involving heavy stones, sharp tools, and techniques that prioritize speed over safety. Accidents are common, and when they happen, the response is typically to determine whether the injured slave can continue working, not whether they need medical attention. You've been injured dozens of times over the past 3 years. Your hands are a map of cuts, scrapes, and poorly healed wounds from handling sharp stone and metal tools. Your shoulders and back bear the permanent marks of heavy stones that slipped while you were carrying them. Your feet have been smashed by falling rocks so many times that several of your toes are permanently deformed. Each injury teaches you something new about pain, about your body's capacity to continue functioning despite damage. about the Roman attitude toward slave welfare. When you cut yourself, you wrap the wound with whatever fabric you can find and continue working. When you strain a muscle, you find ways to compensate using other muscles until the pain becomes manageable. When you break a bone, which has happened twice, you do your best to set it yourself and hope it heals in a position that allows continued labor. Medical care for slaves is limited to interventions that preserve their ability to work. If you're injured badly enough that you can't perform your assigned duties, you're either given light duty until you recover or sold to someone who specializes in buying damaged slaves at discount prices. But if your injury doesn't prevent you from meeting your quotas, it's not considered worthy of attention. The cumulative effect of years of this kind of labor is a body that ages rapidly and breaks down systematically. At 19, you have the posture of a 50-year-old man, the hand strength of someone who's performed manual labor for decades, and the joint problems of someone whose body has been used as a tool rather than treated as a vessel for human life. Your fellow slaves show similar signs of accelerated aging and systematic breakdown. Klaus, who can't be more than 25, moves with the careful deliberation of someone whose body has been pushed beyond its natural limits so many times that he's learned to conserve every bit of strength. His hands, once capable of wielding weapons with deadly precision, now shake slightly when he's holding tools, a sign of nerve damage from repeated impact injuries. Philippos, the older Greek, represents your future if you survive long enough to reach middle age as a slave. His back is permanently bent from decades of heavy lifting. His breathing is labored from years of inhaling stone dust. His hands are gnarled into claw-like shapes from gripping tools for so many years that his joints have frozen in position. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of daily slave labor isn't the physical damage. It's the psychological conditioning that comes with having your body used as a tool by other people. Every day you wake up knowing that your physical strength, your energy, your very life force will be extracted and converted into profit for someone else. You don't work to improve your own situation, to build something for yourself, to develop skills that will benefit your future. You work to meet quotas set by people who view you as a piece of equipment, to generate wealth that you'll never see, to build structures that you'll never be allowed to enjoy. The psychological impact of this kind of labor is profound and lasting. It teaches you that your body is not your own, that your time has no value except as it serves others, that your physical pain and exhaustion are irrelevant as long as you remain productive. It creates a mindset of learned helplessness that goes far deeper than physical exhaustion. It rewires your understanding of what it means to be human. After 3 years of this routine, you no longer think of yourself as a person who happens to be enslaved. You think of yourself as a slave who happens to retain some flickering remnant of personhood. The distinction matters more than you might imagine. When you were first captured, you maintained an internal sense of identity that existed independent of your circumstances. You had dreams, preferences, opinions, plans for escape or revenge. Now those thoughts feel like luxuries you can't afford. Planning for a future beyond tomorrow's quota feels like a waste of mental energy that should be devoted to survival. Having preferences about food, clothing, or comfort feels ridiculous when you have no control over any of those things. Maintaining opinions about politics, religion, or philosophy feels pointless when your only political reality is the absolute power your master holds over your life and death. This psychological transformation is exactly what the Roman slave system is designed to produce. It's not enough to own someone's labor. The system requires owning their sense of self, their capacity to imagine alternatives, their ability to conceive of themselves as deserving better treatment. The overseer's horn blows, signaling the end of another day's labor. Your body screams in relief as you set down your tools, but you know better than to show it. Displaying weakness in front of the overseers is an invitation for tomorrow's work assignment to be even more brutal. You've learned to hide exhaustion behind a mask of steady endurance to make even your most desperate moments look like controlled competence. The walk back to the villa is a forced march of silent suffering. The chains connecting you to your work team clink with each step, a metallic rhythm that has become the soundtrack to your existence. Klaus stumbles slightly, his legs shaking from the day's exertion. and the chain jerks at your ankle, nearly sending you sprawling. But you catch yourself, help steady him, and continue walking without comment. Speaking during the return march is forbidden, but the silence is filled with the sounds of bodies pushed beyond their limits. Heavy breathing, suppressed groans, the shuffle of feet that can barely support their owner's weight. Occasionally someone collapses entirely, and the rest of the chain gang is forced to drag them along until an overseer decides whether they're worth reviving or should be left behind. You've seen both outcomes. Sometimes, a collapsed slave is given a few minutes to recover and is then forced to continue walking. Sometimes they're unchained from the group and abandoned beside the road, left to either recover on their own or die where they fell. The decision seems to depend entirely on the overseer's mood and assessment of the slave's remaining economic value. Tonight, everyone in your chain gang makes it back to the villa alive, but just barely. Brenos, the young Gaul, is walking with a severe limp that suggests he's injured his leg badly enough that he might not be able to work tomorrow. In the Roman system, an injury that prevents work is essentially a death sentence. Slaves who can't meet their quotas are quickly disposed of and replaced. As you enter the villa's slave quarters, the familiar smell of unwashed bodies, human waste, and despair hits you like a physical blow. After a day in the open air of the quarry, returning to the enclosed space where you sleep feels like entering a tomb. The air is thick and stagnant, barely breathable, filled with the sounds of coughing, moaning, and whispered prayers. The sleeping arrangements are designed to maximize the number of slaves that can be housed in the minimum amount of space. You share a concrete cell approximately 8 feet by 10 feet with 6 other slaves. There are no beds, no blankets, no privacy. You sleep on straw that's changed perhaps once a month, when the smell becomes so overwhelming that it starts to affect the health of the more valuable slaves. Your sleeping space is a narrow strip of floor beside the wall, marked by the indentation your body has worn into the stone over 3 years of collapsing in the same spot every night. The slave beside you is a Syrian woman named Lydia, who works in the villa's kitchen. She's been here longer than you have, and her presence is both comforting and terrifying. Comforting because she's survived long enough to become a familiar face. Terrifying because she represents what prolonged slavery does to a human being. Lydia rarely speaks anymore. When she first arrived, she would whisper stories about her life before enslavement, about the family she'd been separated from, about the small acts of resistance that helped her maintain her sanity. Now she stares at the wall with empty eyes and responds to questions with single words or silence. She's learned that hope is a luxury that slaves can't afford, that memory is a source of pain rather than comfort, that the best survival strategy is to think as little as possible about anything beyond the immediate requirements of staying alive. You understand her transformation because you feel it happening to yourself. Each day, a little more of your original personality gets worn away by the relentless demands of survival. The interests, dreams, and relationships that once defined you seem increasingly irrelevant to your current reality. You're becoming a simpler creature, focused entirely on the basic requirements of staying alive and avoiding punishment. But even as your humanity is being systematically stripped away, small moments of connection with your fellow slaves remind you that something essential still survives beneath the surface. When Klaus shares his water ration with Philippos during a particularly hot day, when Brenos teaches you a few words in his native language, when Lydia sometimes hums a melody from her homeland, these tiny acts of kindness prove that the Roman system hasn't completely succeeded in reducing you to mere machinery. These moments are dangerous, though. Emotional connections between slaves are viewed with suspicion by the overseers, who understand that slaves who care about each other are more likely to attempt escape or rebellion. Friendships can be weaponized. The threat of punishment or sale for one slave becomes a way to control the behavior of their friends. Love, in any form, becomes a vulnerability that can be exploited by those who own you. Still think modern employment is slavery? The sound that wakes you isn't the usual horn blast that signals the beginning of another workday. It's the wet, desperate coughing that means someone in your cell is dying. The sound is coming from Brenos, the young Gaul who injured his leg yesterday. What started as a limp has developed into something much worse, His breathing is shallow and labored. His skin is hot with fever, and blood speckles his lips each time he coughs. In the world of free Romans, Brennos would be attended by physicians, given access to healing herbs, allowed to rest until his condition improved. In the world of Roman slavery, he's a depreciating asset whose value is dropping with each labored breath. The question isn't whether he'll receive medical care. It's whether he'll live long enough to be worth the minimal investment required to keep him functional. Roman medicine, when it's available to slaves, is guided by economic calculation rather than humanitarian concern. The master steward will assess the cost of treatment against the slave's remaining economic value, factoring in age, skill level, and estimated years of useful life. If the numbers don't add up favorably, treatment is withheld and the slave is left to recover on their own or die quietly. For Brennos, the calculation is particularly grim. He's young and strong, which works in his favor, but he's also unskilled quarry labor, which means he's easily replaceable. The injury to his leg has already reduced his work capacity, and now the fever suggests a more serious illness that could require weeks of care. From a purely economic standpoint, it might be more cost-effective to let him die and purchase a replacement slave. You've seen this calculation made dozens of times over the past 3 years, and you've learned to read the signs that determine whether a sick slave will receive treatment or be abandoned to die. The steward's expression when he examines the patient, the length of time he spends considering the situation, the questions he asks about the slave's work history and remaining usefulness, all of these factors combine to produce a decision that's presented as medical judgment but is actually financial analysis. When the steward arrives to examine Brennos, his assessment is swift and brutal. He checks the young Gaul's pulse, looks at his eyes, listens to his breathing for perhaps 30 seconds, then makes a note on his wax tablet. No words are spoken, but the meaning is clear. Brennos has been written off as a total loss. What follows is a process that would be recognizable in any business that deals with depreciating assets. Brennos is moved to a section of the slave quarters reserved for the dying, where he'll be given minimal food and water but no actual medical treatment. He'll be allowed to die at his own pace, with the understanding that any resources invested in his care would be wasted money. The section where dying slaves are housed is a concrete room even smaller and more airless than the regular sleeping quarters. It contains no straw, no comfort, no acknowledgement that the people placed there are experiencing the most profound transition in human existence, the movement from life to death. It's simply a place where the process of dying can occur without disrupting the productivity of the healthy slaves. Brennos isn't the only occupant of the dying room. There's an older woman named Helena who's been coughing blood for weeks, a middle-aged man whose back was broken in a construction accident, and a teenage girl whose body is being consumed by some wasting disease that's left her looking like a skeleton, covered in skin. They lie in their own waste, barely conscious, waiting for death to provide the only freedom they'll ever know as slaves. But even this minimal accommodation is more than many sick slaves receive. Those who become ill or injured while working away from the villa are often simply abandoned where they fall. Slaves who collapse in the mines are left in the tunnels. Slaves who become too sick to work in the quarries are abandoned beside the road. Slaves who are injured during transport are pushed off the wagons and left behind. The attitude toward slave mortality is summed up in a phrase you've heard the overseers use. Mortuus est pretium. Death is the price. It's a casual acknowledgement that slave labor involves accepting a certain level of mortality as a cost of doing business. Free Romans who work dangerous jobs are given safety equipment, medical care, and legal protections. Slaves who work the same jobs are considered expendable. 2e. Medical care that is available to slaves is primitive even by Roman standards. Most treatments consist of herbal remedies administered by other slaves who've learned basic healing techniques through trial and error. There are no trained physicians, no systematic approach to diagnosis, no understanding of infection or disease, transmission. Treatment is mostly guesswork combined with hope. For minor injuries, the standard treatment is wine, if available, to clean wounds, strips of cloth for bandages, and continued work, despite pain. The philosophy seems to be that movement prevents joints from stiffening and muscles from weakening, which has just enough truth to it to justify forcing injured slaves to continue working when they should be resting. For more serious injuries, treatment depends on whether the injury is visible and whether it affects the slave's work capacity. A broken arm that prevents lifting is more likely to receive attention than internal injuries that cause constant pain but don't obviously reduce productivity. Slaves with serious injuries that aren't immediately life-threatening often work for months or years with untreated fractures, dislocations, and internal damage. Disease is even more problematic than injury because it's harder to evaluate and more likely to spread to other slaves. When one slave develops a fever or starts coughing, the immediate concern isn't providing treatment. It's preventing the illness from spreading to valuable slaves. Sick slaves are often isolated or disposed of quickly to protect the investment in healthier workers. The irony is that basic medical knowledge that could keep slaves healthier and more productive is readily available, but implementing it would require viewing slaves as valuable long-term assets rather than short-term labor. Sources: better food, cleaner living conditions, regular medical checkups, and prompt treatment of injuries would significantly extend the productive lifespan of slaves and reduce replacement costs. But the Roman economy is built on the assumption that slaves are abundant and cheap, making it more cost-effective to work them to death and replace them than to invest in their long-term health. This calculation works as long as there's a steady supply of new slaves from military conquests and slave raids, but it creates a system where human beings are literally worked to death for economic efficiency. The medical reality of slave life is that most slaves die young from preventable causes. Work-related injuries that could be easily treated become infected and fatal. Diseases that could be cured with rest and proper nutrition instead kill slaves who are forced to continue working while sick. Minor health problems that would be inconveniences for free people become death sentences for slaves who can't afford recovery time. You've learned to perform basic medical care on yourself and your fellow slaves, not because anyone taught you, but because the alternative is watching people die from treatable conditions. You've learned to set bones by feel, to treat infected wounds with whatever materials are available, to recognize the signs of diseases that are likely to be fatal versus those that might be survivable. This self-taught medical knowledge is dangerous, though. Slaves who become known for their healing abilities are sometimes called upon to treat more valuable slaves or even free members of the household. Success in these treatments can earn better treatment and living conditions, but failure can result in punishment or death for deliberately harming a valuable person. The psychological impact of living in constant proximity to untreated suffering and preventable death is profound. You become desensitized to pain, both your own and others, because emotional responsiveness to suffering would make it impossible to function in an environment where suffering is constant and unaddressed. You've watched friends die from infections that could have been treated with basic medical care. You've seen strong people waste away from diseases that could have been cured with proper nutrition and rest. You've witnessed accidents that could have been prevented with minimal safety precautions but instead resulted in permanent disability or death. Each of these experiences teaches you something about the value that Roman society places on slave life, and that lesson is always the same. Slave suffering doesn't matter unless it affects productivity. Slave death doesn't matter unless it affects profit, and slave medical needs don't matter unless they can be addressed cheaply and quickly. The morning sun is rising as Brenos draws his final breath. His death is quiet, unremarkable, witnessed only by the other dying slaves in the concrete room. There will be no funeral, no ceremony, no acknowledgement that a human life has ended. His body will be dragged to the mass grave where all slave corpses are disposed of, and his place in the work gang will be filled by another young man who will probably meet the same fate within a few years. Still think you're having a rough day? The prayer that drifts through the slave quarters in the pre-dawn darkness isn't addressed to Jupiter or Mars or any of the official Roman gods. It's whispered in Aramaic, barely audible, spoken by a Syrian slave who's risking his life to maintain a connection to the faith of his homeland. The words are unfamiliar to you, but the desperate hope in his voice is universal, the sound of someone trying to believe that existence has meaning beyond the daily cycle of labor and suffering. Religion. In the slave quarters is a complicated mixture of forbidden practices, enforced observances, and desperate adaptations. Officially, slaves are expected to participate in the religious rituals of their owners, worshiping the Roman gods who have blessed their masters with wealth and power. Practically, slaves maintain underground networks of belief that provide psychological survival tools and occasional opportunities for resistance. Your own relationship with the divine has been fundamentally altered by enslavement. In your homeland, you worshipped gods who seemed powerful and protective, deities who rewarded courage and punished injustice. Those gods seemed distant and ineffective now, either unable or unwilling to intervene in your suffering. Either they don't care about your pain, or they're not as powerful as you once believed, or they've abandoned you entirely for some failure you can't identify. The religious practices you're forced to participate in as a slave feel like spiritual violence. Every morning, the household slaves are required to make offerings to the gods who have blessed their master's success. You're forced to pray for the continued prosperity of the man who owns you, to ask the gods to grant him success in the very business ventures that depend on your enslavement. The irony is inescapable and intentional. The Roman religious system doesn't just ignore slave suffering. It actively celebrates the conditions that create that suffering. You're required to worship gods who supposedly reward virtue and punish wickedness, while living proof that virtue is irrelevant and wickedness is profitable. You're forced to participate in rituals that give divine approval to a system that treats you as property. But beneath the surface of enforced religious observance, a different kind of spirituality flourishes in the slave quarters. It's a faith system adapted to the realities of powerlessness, focused on survival rather than prosperity, emphasizing endurance rather than victory. The gods worshipped in secret by slaves are often the same deities that are honored publicly by their masters, but they're approached with different prayers and different expectations. When Klaus prays to his Germanic gods, he doesn't ask for victory in battle or success in life. He asks for the strength to survive another day, for the courage to maintain his humanity in dehumanizing circumstances, for the hope that his suffering has some meaning beyond mere economic calculation. His prayers have been stripped of the assumptions about divine justice and earthly reward that characterize free people's religious practices. The Christian slaves present an even more complex religious situation. Christianity is still a relatively new and suspect religion in Rome, associated with political subversion and social disruption. Christian slaves are caught between the Roman suspicion of their faith and the Christian message of spiritual equality that directly contradicts their social status. The Syrian slave who whispers Aramaic prayers practices a form of Christianity that's been shaped by slavery. His faith emphasizes themes of suffering, redemption, and ultimate justice that resonate with slave experience. The Christian promise that the last shall be first, and the first shall be last, provides a theological framework for understanding slavery as a temporary condition rather than a permanent status. But Christian slaves face unique dangers. Their religious practices often involve gatherings that could be interpreted as seditious meetings. Their religious texts contain passages about freedom and equality that could be seen as encouraging rebellion. Their belief in a higher authority than their earthly masters potentially undermines the absolute nature of Roman slavery. The secret Christian services held in the deepest parts of the slave quarters are exercises in theological adaptation. The biblical stories are retold with emphasis on themes of liberation and redemption. The Exodus narrative becomes a metaphor for potential freedom from slavery. The crucifixion becomes a model for understanding suffering as meaningful rather than merely arbitrary. These religious practices serve multiple functions beyond spiritual comfort. They maintain cultural connections to homelands and identities that the Roman system tries to erase. They provide social networks that offer mutual support and protection. They create opportunities for information sharing and occasional coordination of resistance activities. The religious calendar becomes a way of maintaining hope and marking time in lives that would otherwise be consumed by endless repetition. The Syrian Christian slaves count days until religious festivals that they observe in secret. The Germanic slaves mark seasonal changes with rituals that connect them to their ancestral traditions. The Egyptian slaves maintain complicated relationships, with gods who seem both powerful and distant. But religion in the slave quarters also serves as a form of psychological adaptation that can make resistance more difficult. When suffering is interpreted as divinely ordained or spiritually meaningful, it becomes easier to accept rather than challenge. When earthly injustice is balanced against promises of cosmic justice, the urgency of addressing immediate problems diminishes. The theological question that haunts every slave's religious experience is whether their faith calls them to accept their circumstances as divinely ordained or to resist them as spiritually wrong. Different slaves reach different conclusions, often depending on their cultural background, their individual circumstances, and the specific religious traditions they're drawing from. Some find in religion a call to passive endurance, viewing their slavery as a test of spiritual strength or a form of divine punishment that must be accepted with humility. Others find in religion a call to active resistance, viewing their enslavement as a violation of divine law that they're spiritually obligated to oppose. The religious practices that develop in response to slavery often involve theological innovations that would be considered heretical by free adherents of the same faiths. Slave Christianity develops ideas about divine justice and human worth that differ significantly from the Christianity practiced by free Romans. Slave versions of traditional Roman religion emphasize aspects of the gods that free Romans largely ignore. These religious adaptations create their own forms of cultural resistance. When slaves maintain their own interpretations of divine will and human worth, they preserve psychological spaces that remain beyond the reach of their master's control. The inner life of faith becomes a form of freedom that can't be bought, sold, or confiscated. But religious practice in the slave quarters is always dangerous. Discovery of unauthorized religious activities can result in punishment ranging from whipping to crucifixion, depending on how the activities are interpreted by the masters and overseers. Slaves who become known as religious leaders often face particular scrutiny and harassment. The most dangerous religious idea in the slave quarters is the simple theological assertion that all human beings have equal worth in the eyes of God. This concept, which forms the foundation of several religious traditions represented among the slaves, directly contradicts the fundamental assumptions of Roman slavery. When this idea is expressed or acted upon, it's treated as sedition rather than religious belief. Your own religious practice has become a careful balance between maintaining spiritual connection and avoiding dangerous attention. You've learned to pray silently, to practice your faith in ways that don't attract notice, to find meaning in religious ideas without expressing them in ways that could be interpreted as rebellion. The gods you pray to now are not the gods of your childhood. They've been transformed by your experience of powerlessness into deities who understand suffering, who value endurance over victory, who promise ultimate justice rather than immediate intervention. Your prayers have become conversations with divine beings who know what it means to be abandoned, betrayed, and tortured. In the deepest part of the night, when the overseers are asleep and the slave quarters are filled with the quiet sounds of people trying to rest despite pain, you sometimes hear the whispered prayers of your fellow slaves. Each prayer is a small act of rebellion against a system that tries to reduce human beings to economic units. Each prayer asserts that there are values beyond profit, meanings beyond productivity, purposes beyond serving the interests of those who own you. The dawn is breaking, and the overseer's horn will soon announce another day of labor. But in the few minutes of darkness that remain, you whisper your own prayer to whatever gods might be listening. You don't ask for rescue, or revenge, or even relief from suffering. You ask for the strength to remain human in circumstances designed to destroy humanity, for the hope that your pain has some meaning beyond mere economic calculation, for the faith that somewhere beyond the reach of whips and chains, justice still exists. Still believe everything happens for a reason? The scream that echoes across the villa's courtyard this morning isn't the usual sound of workplace discipline. It's something much worse. Marcus Aurelius, the master's son, has discovered that one of his personal slaves has been stealing small amounts of food to feed his sick daughter. The punishment for this transgression won't be a simple whipping. It will be crucifixion, performed in front of all the slaves as a reminder of what happens when property dares to act like it has rights. The social hierarchy of Roman slavery is a carefully constructed system of power relationships designed to maintain absolute control over human beings who outnumber their owners by significant margins. At the top of this hierarchy sits the master, whose power over his slaves is literally a matter of life and death. Below him are various levels of overseers, stewards, and privileged slaves, each with specific roles in maintaining the system. At the bottom are field slaves, mine workers, and other laborers whose lives have no value beyond their economic productivity. But within this seemingly simple hierarchy lies a complex web of relationships, rivalries, and survival strategies that make slave society as complicated as any free community. The difference is that every relationship is shaped by the underlying reality of absolute powerlessness. No slave, regardless of their position in the hierarchy, has any legal rights or protections against the arbitrary exercise of power by those above them. The master's power over his slaves is total and legally unlimited. He can sell them, punish them, rape them, kill them, or dispose of them in any way he chooses, without needing to justify his decisions to any authority. This absolute power creates a psychological dynamic where the master's mood and personality determine the daily reality for hundreds of human beings. Your current master, Gaius Flavius Maximus, is considered relatively moderate by Roman standards, which means he kills his slaves less frequently than some other wealthy Romans and provides marginally better living conditions than the absolute minimum required to maintain productivity. But his moderation is still built on the foundation of absolute power, and when he chooses to exercise that power, the results are swift and brutal. The social structure immediately below the master consists of his family members, each of whom has different relationships with and power over the slave population. The master's wife has authority over household slaves and often exercises it with a petty cruelty that compensates for her own lack of power in Roman society. The master's children are raised to view slaves as property and often develop sadistic tendencies that they practice on human beings who can't resist or retaliate. Marcus Aurelius, the master's 18-year-old son, represents the most dangerous element in the slave hierarchy because he has nearly unlimited power, but lacks the experience and judgment to exercise it wisely. Young Roman men are encouraged to view slaves as appropriate targets for violence and sexual experimentation, and Marcus Aurelius has embraced this role with enthusiasm. He's the one who decided that stealing food deserves crucifixion. He's the one who regularly selects female slaves for rape, treating it as a form of entertainment rather than violence. He's the one who organizes gladiator games where slaves are forced to fight each other for his amusement, often to the death. The legal system provides no protection against this abuse because slaves have no legal status as persons. They can't own property, can't enter into contracts, can't testify against free people in court, can't seek legal remedies for violence or exploitation. In the eyes of Roman law, violence against slaves is not assault, it's property management. Below the family level, the slave hierarchy is managed by a system of overseers and privileged slaves who serve as intermediaries between the masters and the labor force. These positions are coveted because they offer slightly better living conditions and some protection from the worst forms of abuse, but they also require participating in the oppression of fellow slaves. Gaius, the head overseer, is a freed slave who earned his manumission through 20 years of loyal service. His position now requires him to be more brutal toward current slaves than many free-born Romans would be, because he has to constantly prove his loyalty to the system that freed him. Former slaves who become overseers often become the most vicious, enforcers of slave discipline because they understand the system from the inside and know exactly how to inflict maximum psychological damage. The privileged slaves who work in the master's household occupy an ambiguous position in the hierarchy. They have better food, better living conditions, and protection from the most dangerous forms of labor, but they're also more closely supervised and held to higher standards of behavior. A household slave who makes a mistake faces punishments that field slaves would never experience because their errors are more visible to the master's family. Lydia, the Syrian woman who works in the kitchen, has survived in her position for 8 years by developing an almost supernatural ability to anticipate the moods and needs of the master's family. She's learned to be invisible when invisibility is required, helpful when help is needed, and decorative when decoration is desired. But her survival strategy requires a level of psychological self-suppression that has effectively erased her original personality. The sexual dynamics within the slave hierarchy add another layer of complexity and violence to an already brutal system. Female slaves have no protection against rape by their masters, the master's family, or any free person the master chooses to give access to them. Male slaves can also be sexually exploited, particularly young men who are considered attractive by their masters. Sexual violence against slaves is so common that it's rarely remarked upon. It's considered a natural privilege of ownership, like the right to assign work duties or determine living conditions. The children produced by these rapes become slaves themselves, adding to their mother's burden and the master's wealth. But sexual exploitation creates its own forms of hierarchy and competition among slaves. Women who become sexual favorites of their masters sometimes receive better treatment and protection, but they also become targets of resentment from other slaves and face the constant threat of falling from favor. The psychological damage from sexual slavery often makes these women incapable of forming normal relationships with fellow slaves. The social relationships between slaves themselves are shaped by the constant pressure of survival and the ever-present possibility of betrayal. Friendships are dangerous because they can be exploited by overseers who use threats against friends to control behavior. Love is dangerous because loved ones can be sold, punished, or killed as a form of indirect torture. Yet, human connection persists even in these conditions. Slaves form marriages that have no legal recognition, but provide emotional support and mutual protection. They create substitute family relationships that help replace the biological families that were destroyed by enslavement. They develop codes of mutual aid and protection that operate beneath the surface of the official hierarchy. These relationships are constantly tested by the pressures of the system. When food is scarce, do you share your rations with a sick friend or preserve your strength for tomorrow's labor? When an overseer demands information about rule violations, do you protect a fellow slave at the risk of punishment or provide information to avoid trouble? When escape opportunities arise, do you include others in your plans or increase your chances of success by acting alone? The violence that maintains the slave system operates on multiple levels simultaneously. There's the spectacular violence of public punishments like crucifixions and gladiator games designed to terrorize the slave population into submission. There's the routine violence of whippings and beatings that enforce daily discipline. And there's the structural violence of malnutrition, overwork, and dangerous living conditions that slowly destroys slaves' health and shortens their lives. But perhaps the most insidious form of violence is the psychological warfare that turns slaves against each other. The system creates situations where slaves must compete for basic necessities, where survival often requires betraying fellow slaves, where advancement within the hierarchy depends on participating in the oppression of others. The slave who reports rule violations to avoid punishment himself. The privileged slave who must abuse field slaves to maintain his position. The overseer who was once a slave but now enforces discipline more brutally than free-born Romans. These situations create moral injury that goes beyond physical suffering. They force people to participate in their own oppression and the oppression of others. The rebellion that occasionally erupts in slave communities is usually triggered not by physical abuse, which is constant, but by violations of the unwritten codes that govern relationships between slaves. When someone betrays the trust of fellow slaves, when privilege is used to exploit rather than protect the vulnerable, when survival strategies cross the line into collaboration with oppression, these are the moments when slaves risk everything to restore some form of justice to their world, but rebellion is almost always futile and always fatal. The Roman military system is designed to suppress slave uprisings quickly and brutally. Crucifixion is the standard punishment for rebels, but creative Roman sadists have developed dozens of other methods for inflicting prolonged public death on slaves who dare to resist their condition. The social structure of slavery creates a form of hell where human beings are trapped not just by chains and whips, but by relationships that have been poisoned by power and fear. Every connection between people becomes a potential source of suffering. Every act of kindness becomes a vulnerability that can be exploited. Every attempt to maintain humanity in dehumanizing circumstances requires risking everything. You've learned to navigate this system by developing relationships that are deep enough to provide mutual support, but not so deep that they become weapons that can be used against you. You've learned to show loyalty without creating obligations that could be fatal. You've learned to accept help without creating debts that could be called in at dangerous moments. The slave who's about to be crucified made the mistake of putting his love for his daughter above his understanding of the social system that governs his existence. He thought he could steal food without consequences because the moral law that governs parent-child relationships felt more real to him than the legal system that governs master-slave relationships. He was wrong, and his mistake will cost him his life. But as the cross is being prepared and the nails are being heated, every slave in the courtyard understands that his crime wasn't theft. It was believing that his relationships with other human beings mattered more than his relationship with the system that owns him. The screaming will continue for hours, maybe days, depending on how long it takes him to die. And every scream will be a reminder that in the social hierarchy of Roman slavery, love is not just powerless, it's dangerous. Still, think you've got relationship problems? The fever starts on a Tuesday morning in late autumn, just another symptom in a body that's already failing from 3.5 years of systematic abuse. At first, you mistake it for the usual exhaustion that comes from quarry work, the bone-deep weariness that never fully goes away no matter how much you rest. But by midday, when the sun feels like it's burning through your skin and your hands shake too much to hold the tools properly, you realize this is something different, something final. The overseer notices your decreased productivity before you're willing to admit the severity of your condition. Gaius walks over to where you're working, his expression already showing the calculation that determines whether a sick slave is worth the cost of treatment or should be written off as a total loss. "You're moving like an old woman," he says, not bothering to lower his voice. The other slaves in your work gang hear the comment and automatically increase their own pace, understanding that association with a failing slave could result in punishment or suspicion. "How much longer can you work today?" The question isn't motivated by concern for your welfare. It's a business assessment designed to determine whether you can complete your assigned tasks or whether your work will need to be redistributed to other slaves. The honest answer is that you're not sure you can work for another hour, much less complete a full day, but admitting weakness to an overseer is essentially signing your own death warrant. "I can finish the day," you tell him, which is probably a lie, but might buy you enough time to recover or at least delay the inevitable decision about your disposal. Gaius studies your face with the practiced eye of someone who's evaluated hundreds of sick slaves over the years. He's looking for signs that indicate whether this is a temporary illness that will resolve with rest or a more serious condition that will permanently reduce your economic value. The decision he makes in the next few seconds will determine whether you live or die. "You'll finish today's quota," he decides. "If you can't work tomorrow, you'll be moved to the disposal section." The disposal section. Even the name is designed to remove any humanity from the process of dying. It's not a hospital or infirmary or even a place where sick people rest. It's where slaves are stored while they complete the process of becoming completely worthless to their owners. You've seen the disposal section, though slaves are discouraged from spending time there. It's a concrete room with no windows, no furniture, no comfort of any kind. Slaves who are placed there are given minimal food and water, but no medical treatment, no pain relief, no human beyond what's absolutely necessary to prevent the spread of disease to more valuable property. The logic is simple and brutal. If you're too sick to work, you're consuming resources without producing anything in return. The disposal section exists to contain that loss while nature completes the economic calculation. That night, your fever breaks temporarily, and you allow yourself to hope that maybe you can recover enough to avoid the disposal section. You force yourself to eat the thin gruel that passes for dinner, even though your stomach rebels against it. You try to sleep despite the chills that make your whole body shake. You pray to whatever gods might be listening, Roman gods, foreign gods, the Christian God that some slaves whisper about in secret. But when dawn comes, you can barely lift your head from the straw mattress. Your limbs feel like they're made of lead, and every breath requires conscious effort. The other slaves in your quarters avoid looking at you directly, understanding that your condition is a reminder of their own mortality and the fragility of their existence. When Gaius arrives for the morning head count, he doesn't even bother to ask how you're feeling. One look at your condition provides all the information he needs. He makes a note on his wax tablet, probably recording the loss of one slave from his work gang, and signals to 2 other slaves to carry you to the disposal section. Wait, you whisper, though you're not sure what you're asking for. More time? A chance to prove you can still work? Some form of mercy that doesn't exist in this system? Gaius doesn't respond. He's already moved on to checking the other slaves, his attention focused on the living property that can still generate value for their owner. You've crossed the line from asset to liability, and in the Roman economic system, liabilities are eliminated as efficiently as possible, beyond what's absolutely necessary to prevent the spread of disease to more valuable property. The logic is simple and brutal. If you're too sick to work, you're consuming resources without producing anything in return. The disposal section exists to contain that loss while nature completes the economic calculation. That night, your fever breaks temporarily, and you allow yourself to hope that maybe you can recover enough to avoid the disposal section. You force yourself to eat the thin gruel that passes for dinner, even though your stomach rebels against it. You try to sleep despite the chills that make your whole body shake. You pray to whatever gods might be listening, Roman gods, foreign gods, the Christian God that some slaves whisper about in secret. But when dawn comes, you can barely lift your head from the straw mattress. Your limbs feel like they're made of lead, and every breath requires conscious effort. The other slaves in your quarters avoid looking at you directly, understanding that your condition is a reminder of their own mortality and the fragility of their existence. When Gaius arrives for the morning head count, he doesn't even bother to ask how you're feeling. One look at your condition provides all the information he needs. He makes a note on his wax tablet, probably recording the loss of one slave from his work gang, and signals to 2 other slaves to carry you to the disposal section. Wait, you whisper, though you're not sure what you're asking for. More time? A chance to prove you can still work? Some form of mercy that doesn't exist in this system? Gaius doesn't respond. He's already moved on to checking the other slaves, his attention focused on the living property that can still generate value for their owner. You've crossed the line from asset to liability, and in the Roman economic system, liabilities are eliminated as efficiently as possible. The 2 slaves who carry you to the disposal section are men you've worked alongside for months. They know your name, your story, the family you lost when you were captured. But they can't meet your eyes as they transport you, because acknowledging your humanity would make their own situation unbearable. They're not carrying a person to his death. They're disposing of broken equipment. The disposal section is worse than you imagined. The smell hits you first. Unwashed bodies, human waste, and the sweet, sickly odor of people who are dying slowly. The room is larger than you expected, with maybe 20 other slaves in various stages of decline. Some are sitting up, still fighting their conditions. Others are lying motionless, too weak to lift their heads. They place you on a patch of bare concrete near the back wall. There's no straw, no blanket, no pillow. Just cold stone and the company of other human beings who've been written off as economic losses. A clay pot of water sits near the center of the room, and you understand that this represents the entire medical care system available to dying slaves. The man next to you has been here for at least a week, based on the condition of his body and the way he's given up trying to maintain any dignity. He's younger than you, maybe in his early 20s, but his eyes have the hollow look of someone who's already begun the process of letting go. "First day?" he asks, his voice barely above a whisper. You nod, not trusting your voice to remain steady. "It's not so bad," he lies, probably trying to offer some comfort. "Sometimes they let people go back to work if they recover quickly enough." You both know this isn't true. The disposal section is a one-way destination, but the lie serves a purpose. It allows both of you to maintain the pretense that survival is still possible. Over the next few days, you learn the rhythms of dying. In ancient Rome, a slave comes twice a day with a small amount of water and some stale bread. Not enough to maintain health, but sufficient to prolong the process of dying. The logic is economic. Keeping dying slaves alive for a few extra days costs very little, and occasionally one recovers enough to return to work. But mostly, they die. You. Watch it happen to the man who was next to you when you arrived. His breathing becomes more labored each day, his responses to conversation grow shorter, and eventually, he stops responding at all. When he dies, 2 slaves come to remove his body. They're not wearing any special clothing or following any particular ritual. They're just removing garbage that's accumulated in a storage room. Where do they take them? You ask one of the removal slaves. Mass grave outside the city, he replies without emotion. No markers, no names. Just a pit that gets filled when it's full. This is how your story ends. Not with a heroic battle or a peaceful death surrounded by family. Not with last words that will be remembered or a grave that will be visited. You die in a concrete room, forgotten before you're even dead, and your body is disposed of like refuse. The fever returns on your 4th day in the disposal section, stronger than before. This time, there's no hope of recovery, no possibility of returning to work. Your body has finally reached the point where it can no longer sustain the abuse that's been inflicted on it for years. You think about your family, your parents, your siblings, maybe children of your own who were sold separately when you were captured. You wonder if they're still alive, if they remember you, if they know you're dying. But these thoughts are interrupted by practical concerns, the pain in your chest, the difficulty breathing, the way your vision keeps going dark around the edges. On your 6th day in the disposal section, you stop being able to sit up. On your 7th day, you stop being able to speak. On your 8th day, you stop being able to open your eyes, and on your 9th day, you stop. Just like that. No fanfare, no ceremony, no recognition that a human life has ended. The slave who brings water in the morning notices that you're not breathing and makes a note to have your body removed. By evening, you're in the mass grave outside Rome, covered with lime and dirt, your individual existence erased from history. Your name was never recorded in any official document. Your birth wasn't noted by any historian. Your death wasn't mourned by anyone with the power to preserve the memory. You lived for maybe 25 years, spent the last 4 of them in slavery, and died without leaving any trace that you ever existed. This is the fate of millions of people in the ancient world. Not the emperors and generals whose names fill the history books, but the anonymous human beings whose labor built the monuments and whose suffering funded the glory of empire. You were one grain of sand in a desert of forgotten lives, and the only difference between you and the person reading this story is an accident of birth that occurred 2,000 years apart. Still think the past was simpler? Still romanticize the glory of ancient Rome? The Colosseum you admire in photographs was built by people like you, people whose names nobody remembered and whose graves nobody marked. The roads that carried Roman legions to conquest were paved with the broken bodies of slaves who died in quarries and construction sites. Your death wasn't unique or particularly tragic by the standards of your time. It was routine, expected, and economically rational. You were born into a world that considered you property, lived your entire life as an object to be used, and died when you were no longer useful. And the world continued spinning without noticing your absence. The arithmetic of human suffering in ancient Rome is almost impossible to comprehend from the comfort of the modern world. Conservative estimates suggest that 30% of the population of the Roman Empire consisted of slaves, perhaps 15 to 20 million human beings living as property at any given time. That's more than the entire population of most modern nations, reduced to the legal status of livestock. But numbers, no matter how staggering, can't capture the individual weight of each broken life. Behind every statistic was a person like you, someone with dreams, fears, memories of freedom, and the full range of human emotions compressed into a body that existed solely for the economic benefit of another person. Your story wasn't exceptional. It was ordinary, and that's what makes it so horrifying. Every day in every corner of the Roman Empire, thousands of people experienced variations of your existence. They woke up in slave quarters, performed backbreaking labor, endured systematic dehumanization, and died without leaving any mark on the historical record. Their collective suffering built the infrastructure of Western civilization, and their names have been lost to time. The Romans didn't see this as a moral problem. Slavery was so integrated into their economic and social systems that questioning it would have been like questioning the movement of the sun across the sky. It was simply the natural order of things. Some people were born to rule, others to serve, and the distinction between the two was maintained through violence and law. Modern people often imagine that they would have been opposed to slavery if they had lived in ancient times, but this comforting assumption ignores the power of normalized brutality. The Romans weren't uniquely evil people who consciously chose to build their society on human suffering. They were ordinary people who inherited a system that defined some human beings as property and never seriously questioned the fundamental assumptions that made such a system possible. The parallels to modern times are uncomfortable but undeniable. According to contemporary estimates, there are more people living in conditions of slavery today than at any point in human history. Perhaps 40 to 50 million people trapped in forced labor, human trafficking, and debt bondage. The legal frameworks have changed, but the essential economic logic remains the same. Some people profit from the systematic exploitation of others, and the victims remain largely invisible to the broader society. Your death in that concrete room represents more than just individual tragedy. It symbolizes the capacity of human societies to organize themselves around the principle that some lives matter more than others, and that economic efficiency justifies almost any level of human suffering. The Romans built magnificent temples to their gods while those gods' supposed worshippers died in quarries. They wrote philosophical treatises about virtue and justice while maintaining legal systems that defined human beings as objects. They celebrated military victories that were funded by the labor of people who would never benefit from the glory of conquest. This contradiction between high ideals and brutal realities wasn't unique to Rome. It's a pattern that repeats throughout human history. Wherever societies develop economic systems that depend on the exploitation of vulnerable populations, the specific forms change, but the underlying logic remains consistent. The suffering of the powerless is an acceptable cost for the comfort of the powerful. Your individual story matters because it refuses to let these systems hide behind abstract language and comfortable distances. You weren't a labor unit or a human resource or any other euphemism designed to obscure the reality of exploitation. You were a person with a name, a personality, relationships, hopes, and fears. You experienced physical pain, emotional trauma, and psychological degradation. You died alone and forgotten, and you were one of millions. The Roman Empire fell more than 1,500 years ago, but the habits of mind that made your enslavement possible persist in different forms. The tendency to see some people as more valuable than others, to prioritize economic efficiency over human dignity, to accept normalized suffering as the natural order of things. These patterns of thought didn't disappear with the collapse of ancient civilizations. They evolved, adapted, and found new expressions in different historical contexts. The plantations of the American South, the factories of the Industrial Revolution, the sweatshops of the global economy, all of these systems depend on the same fundamental principle that made your enslavement possible: the belief that some people's lives are worth less than others. Your story serves as a reminder that progress isn't inevitable, and that the rights and freedoms that modern people take for granted are fragile achievements that must be actively defended. The distance between your concrete cell and a modern apartment isn't just measured in years. It's measured in countless individual decisions to reject the logic of exploitation and to insist on the equal dignity of all human beings. Every time someone chooses to see the humanity in another person rather than their economic utility, they're taking a small step away from the world that killed you Every time someone questions a system that benefits them at the expense of others, they're honoring the memory of the millions who died without names or graves. The Romans believed that their empire would last forever. They carved their achievements in stone and bronze, wrote their histories in imperishable books, and built monuments designed to outlast the ages. But empires fall, monuments crumble, and books turn to dust. What remains is the weight of individual human experiences, the accumulated suffering and joy, hope and despair, love and loss of billions of people whose lives shaped the world we inhabit today. Your life mattered not because of what you accomplished or how you're remembered, but because you lived, because you felt, because you were fully human in a world that denied your humanity. And in the end, that's the only victory that matters, against systems designed to reduce people to objects, the stubborn insistence on remaining human, even when humanity itself is under attack. Still think your problems are insurmountable? Still believe that your life is meaningless? You're reading these words on a device that would have seemed like magic to the Romans. In a world where your basic dignity as a human being is recognized by law, if not always by practice, with freedoms that billions of people throughout history could never have imagined. Your ancestors, people exactly like you who happened to be born into different circumstances, endured slavery, persecution, war, famine, disease, and early death, so that you could have the opportunity to complain about slow internet and difficult commutes. They died in quarries and plantations and factories and battlefields, most of them forgotten, all of them fully human. Their lives weren't meaningless, and neither is yours. The only difference is that you have choices they never had, opportunities they never saw, and freedoms they never experienced. What you do with those gifts is up to you. But remember the concrete room. Remember the mass grave. Remember that your comfort was built on the suffering of people who were no different from you, except in the accident of when and where they were born. And remember that somewhere in the world right now, someone is lying on a concrete floor, forgotten, and dying so that other people can live more comfortably. The Romans are gone, but the systems that killed you are still here, in different forms, with different victims justified by different ideologies. The question isn't whether you would have been a slave owner in ancient Rome. The question is what you're going to do about the slavery that exists in your own time. Because the concrete room is still there, it just has a different address.